Paleolithic Europe stretched from the Atlantic coastline to the Ural Mountains, encompassing a vast range of environments shaped by glacial and interglacial cycles. Ice sheets advanced and retreated across the northern latitudes, creating tundra, steppe, and forested zones that shifted over tens of thousands of years. These environmental transformations influenced where humans could live, what resources they could exploit, and how they moved across the landscape. The archaeological record of this period is fragmentary and unevenly preserved, with better survival in limestone caves than in open-air settings. Researchers rely on stone tools, bone remains, and occasional organic materials to reconstruct human presence. The scale of time involved spans roughly 1.4 million years, from the earliest known human entry into Europe to the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago. Europe during the Paleolithic was shaped by repeated glacial and interglacial periods that altered sea levels, vegetation, and animal distributions. Ice sheets covered Scandinavia, Britain, and northern sections of the continent during glacial maxima, pushing habitable zones southward. Sea levels dropped by more than 100 meters during these cold phases, exposing land bridges such as Doggerland, which connected Britain to continental Europe. The Mediterranean remained an important refuge area, along with the Iberian Peninsula, southern France, and the Italian Peninsula, where temperatures stayed relatively moderate even during the coldest periods. The landscape varied dramatically depending on latitude and proximity to ice margins. Northern regions experienced periglacial tundra conditions with permafrost, sparse vegetation, and limited tree cover. Further south, cold steppe and grasslands dominated, supporting large herds of grazing animals. Forested zones contracted during glacial periods and expanded during warmer interglacials, with deciduous and coniferous forests covering much of Central and Southern Europe when climatic conditions allowed. River valleys provided critical corridors for movement and settlement, offering access to water, diverse plant resources, and concentrations of game animals. Major river systems included the Danube, Rhine, Rhone, and Dnieper, which flowed through varied terrain and connected different ecological zones. These rivers shifted course over time as glaciers advanced and retreated, creating new floodplains and altering drainage patterns. Coastal regions also changed significantly, with shorelines moving inland or outward depending on ice volume and sea level. The Black Sea and Mediterranean coastlines were markedly different during glacial periods, with reduced water levels and exposed continental shelves. Climate fluctuations occurred on multiple timescales, from long glacial-interglacial cycles lasting tens of thousands of years to shorter oscillations within those broader phases. The last glacial maximum, which peaked approximately 26,000 to 19,000 years ago, represents the most recent and best documented cold extreme. During this time, ice covered large portions of northern Europe, and temperatures across the continent were significantly lower than today. Precipitation patterns also shifted, with some areas becoming drier and others experiencing increased moisture depending on atmospheric circulation changes. Vegetation responded to these climatic shifts, with changes in species composition and distribution. Cold-adapted plants such as grasses, sedges, and dwarf shrubs dominated during glacial periods, while temperate species retreated to southern refugia. Pollen records from lake sediments and peat bogs provide evidence of these shifts, showing rapid transitions between different plant communities as temperatures changed. Archaeologists use pollen data alongside animal remains to reconstruct the environments that early humans encountered and exploited. Animal populations were equally dynamic, with species migrating in response to changing habitats. Large mammals, such as woolly mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, steppe bison, reindeer, horses, and red deer moved across the landscape following vegetation zones. Cave bears, cave lions, and hyenas occupied various ecological niches with distributions that shifted over time. Some species became extinct during or after the last glacial maximum, while others survived into the post-glacial period. The availability of these animals directly affected human subsistence strategies and settlement patterns. Topographic diversity also influenced human occupation. Mountain ranges such as the Alps, Pyrenees, Carpathians, and Caucasus created barriers and corridors, channeling movement and isolating populations. Cave systems in limestone regions provided shelter and preserved archaeological materials more effectively than open-air sites. These caves are overrepresented in the archaeological record, which can skew interpretations of settlement patterns. Open-air sites existed but are less frequently preserved, particularly in areas subject to erosion, glacial activity, or sediment deposition. Soil formation and erosion processes varied across Europe, affecting site preservation. Loess deposits, formed from wind-blown silt during cold, dry periods, accumulated in certain regions and buried some archaeological sites while destroying others. River terraces preserved stratified deposits in some valleys, allowing researchers to establish chronological sequences of occupation. Coastal erosion and sea level rise have destroyed many sites along former shorelines, leaving gaps in the archaeological record of coastal adaptations. Understanding the Paleolithic European environment requires integrating multiple lines of evidence, including geology, paleoclimatology, paleobotany, and paleozoology. Ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica provide long-term climate records that can be correlated with European sequences. Marine sediment cores offer additional data on temperature and precipitation changes affecting the continent. Speleothems, or cave formations such as stalagmites, preserve chemical signatures of past climate conditions and can be precisely dated using uranium series methods. The environmental diversity of Paleolithic Europe meant that human groups encountered widely different conditions depending on where and when they lived. Northern populations during glacial periods faced extreme cold and resource scarcity, while southern groups in Mediterranean refugia experienced milder conditions with more stable resource availability. These environmental differences shaped technological choices, subsistence strategies, and social organization in ways that are reflected in the archaeological record. Human adaptation to these varied and changing environments required flexibility in both technology and behavior. Groups needed to respond to seasonal shifts in resource availability, long-term climate trends, and unpredictable environmental events. The archaeological evidence suggests that Paleolithic populations successfully navigated these challenges through a combination of mobility, technological innovation, and knowledge of local landscapes and resources. The earliest evidence of human presence in Europe dates to approximately 1.4 million years ago, based on stone tools and fossil remains found at sites in Spain and Georgia. These initial colonizers were archaic humans, likely members of the species Homo erectus, or closely related forms, who entered Europe from Africa via the Levant, or across the Strait of Gibraltar. The archaeological record from this early period is sparse and geographically limited, with most sites concentrated in southern Europe, where climatic conditions were more favorable. One of the oldest known sites is Barranco León in southeastern Spain, where stone tools have been dated to around 1.4 million years ago. Another early site, Orsay, also in Spain, has yielded stone artifacts and possible human remains from a similar time period, though the identification of human fossils from this site remains debated among researchers. In the Caucasus region, the site of Dmanisi in Georgia has produced hominin fossils and tools dated to approximately 1.8 million years ago, representing some of the earliest evidence of human presence outside Africa, though Georgia is sometimes considered part of Western Asia rather than Europe proper. The Grandolina site in the Atapuerca Mountains of northern Spain has provided significant evidence of early human occupation, with fossils assigned to Homo antecessor dated to approximately 900,000 years ago. These remains include fragments of multiple individuals and are associated with simple stone tools and evidence of butchery activities. The presence of cut marks on human bones at Grandolina has led researchers to suggest that cannibalism occurred at this site, though the context and motivations remain subjects of debate. Stone tool assemblages from the Lower Paleolithic in Europe are characterized by simple core and flake technologies. The Old Owan tradition, defined by basic choppers and flakes struck from cobbles, appears at some of the earliest sites. This technology gradually gave way to the Acheulean tradition, which featured hand axes and cleavers produced through more systematic flaking techniques. Acheulean tools appear in Europe by approximately 700,000 years ago and persist in various forms for hundreds of thousands of years. The distribution of Lower Paleolithic sites suggests that early human populations were concentrated in southern and central Europe, with limited evidence of occupation in northern regions. This pattern likely reflects both climatic constraints and preservation biases. Glacial advances would have made northern areas uninhabitable during cold periods, and subsequent erosion may have destroyed sites that did exist. The Mediterranean basin, the Italian peninsula, and parts of France show more continuous evidence of human presence during this time. Population densities during the Lower Paleolithic were extremely low, with small mobile groups scattered across vast territories. Archaeologists estimate that entire regions may have been occupied by only a few hundred individuals at any given time. These groups likely lived in bands of 20 to 50 people, moving frequently to exploit seasonal resources and following animal migrations. Social organization was probably based on kinship ties, with limited evidence for complex hierarchies or specialized roles. The Boxgrove site in southern England provides evidence of human activity approximately 500,000 years ago, during an interglacial period when Britain was connected to continental Europe. Excavations at Boxgrove have uncovered Acheulean hand axes, butchered animal bones, and a hominin tibia, indicating that humans had expanded their range into northwestern Europe during favorable climatic periods. The tools at Boxgrove show sophisticated flaking techniques and appear to have been used for processing large game such as horses and rhinoceroses. Clactonian assemblages, named after the site of Clacton-on-Sea in England, represent another Lower Paleolithic tradition characterized by core and flake tools without hand axes. The relationship between Clactonian and Acheulean technologies has been debated, with some researchers arguing that they represent different cultural traditions, while others suggest they reflect different activities or raw material constraints. The chronological overlap between these traditions complicates interpretations of technological development and population movements. Evidence of controlled fire use appears sporadically in the Lower Paleolithic record. The site of Gesher Beno Yaakov in Israel, dated to approximately 790,000 years ago, shows clear evidence of repeated fire use, but comparable evidence from European sites of similar age is less definitive. Some researchers argue that hearths and burned bones at sites such as Vertes in Hungary and Terra Amata in France indicate fire control by 400,000 years ago, while others contend that natural fires could account for some of these deposits. The ability to control fire would have provided significant advantages for warmth, cooking, and predator defense, particularly in cooler European climates. The Heidelberg fossils, named after a jaw discovered near Heidelberg, Germany, represent a hominin form that appears in Europe by approximately 600,000 years ago. Homo heidelbergensis is considered by many researchers to be the ancestor of both Neanderthals in Europe and modern humans in Africa, though the taxonomic classification and evolutionary relationships remain subjects of ongoing research. Fossils attributed to this species or similar archaic humans have been found at multiple sites across Europe, including Mauer in Germany, Arago in France, and Petralona in Greece. The Cima de los Huesos site in the Atapuerca Mountains has yielded an extraordinary collection of hominin fossils dated to approximately 430,000 years ago. The site contains remains of at least 28 individuals, representing one of the largest collections of Middle Pleistocene human fossils in the world. These fossils show features intermediate between Homo heidelbergensis and Neanderthals, suggesting that Neanderthal characteristics were beginning to emerge by this time. The accumulation of bodies in a deep cave shaft has led researchers to propose that the site represents deliberate disposal of the dead, though alternative explanations involving natural accumulation have also been suggested. Lower Paleolithic subsistence strategies focused on hunting and gathering, with evidence of large game hunting at numerous sites. Cut marks on animal bones indicate systematic butchery, and the association of stone tools with prey remains suggests that humans were processing carcasses they had either hunted or scavenged. The relative importance of hunting versus scavenging during this period remains debated, with some researchers arguing that early humans primarily scavenged carcasses killed by other predators, while others contend that organized hunting was a significant component of subsistence. Plant resources likely played an important role in lower Paleolithic diets, but direct evidence is scarce due to poor preservation of organic materials. Phytoliths and starch grains recovered from stone tools at some sites suggest that plant processing occurred, but the specific plants exploited and their dietary importance remain largely unknown. Seasonal availability of plants, seeds, nuts, and fruits would have influenced settlement patterns and group movements. The Lower Paleolithic in Europe represents a long period of gradual technological and behavioral change, with human populations adapting to diverse and fluctuating environments. The archaeological record shows repeated colonization attempts, local extinctions, and recolonization as climatic conditions changed. By the end of this period, archaic human populations had established a presence across much of Europe and had developed the technologies and behaviors that would be elaborated by their Neanderthal descendants. Neanderthals emerged in Europe approximately 400,000 years ago and became the dominant hominin population across the continent until their disappearance around 40,000 years ago. Their fossils have been found from Gibraltar in the southwest to the Altai Mountains in Siberia, with the densest concentrations in Western and Central Europe. The name derives from the Neander Valley in Germany, where the first recognized specimen was discovered in 1856. Subsequent finds at numerous sites have provided extensive information about Neanderthal anatomy, behavior, and material culture. Neanderthal physical characteristics included robust builds, large brow ridges, prominent noses, and barrel-shaped rib cages. Brain sizes were comparable to or slightly larger than those of modern humans, averaging around 1,500 cubic centimeters. Skeletal evidence indicates significant muscle mass and bone density, suggesting high levels of physical activity and strength. These anatomical features likely represented adaptations to cold climates and the demands of hunting large game in challenging environments. The Middle Paleolithic, also known as the Mousterian, after the type site of Le Moustier in France, is characterized by prepared core technologies and the production of flakes with predetermined shapes. The Levallois technique, in which cores were carefully shaped before flakes were struck off, became widespread during this period. Neanderthals produced a variety of stone tools, including points, scrapers, and denticulates, with assemblages varying by region and time period. Some researchers have identified distinct Mousterian variants, such as the Quina and Ferrasi types, though debate continues about whether these represent cultural traditions, functional differences, or chronological phases. Neanderthal sites are concentrated in cave and rock shelter locations, particularly in limestone regions where preservation is favorable. Major sites include La Chapelle aux Saints, La Ferracie, and Le Moustier in France. Shanidar Cave in Iraq, Krapina in Croatia, and Spy Cave in Belgium. Open-air sites are less common in the archaeological record, but include locations such as Salzgitter Lebensstätte in Germany and Maastricht Belvedere in the Netherlands. The overrepresentation of cave sites may create a biased understanding of settlement patterns, as Neanderthals likely used open-air locations more frequently than the preserved record suggests. Subsistence strategies relied heavily on hunting medium to large mammals. Faunal assemblages from Neanderthal sites show remains of reindeer, red deer, horses, bison, woolly rhinoceroses, and mammoths. Cut marks and percussion marks on bones indicate systematic butchery and marrow extraction. Some sites show evidence of specialized hunting of particular species, suggesting that groups targeted specific prey based on local availability and seasonal patterns. The Moran site in France contains accumulations of bison bones, while Salzgitter Lebensstätte shows evidence of reindeer hunting during autumn migrations. Evidence for plant use by Neanderthals comes from dental calculus, coprolites, and rare preservation of plant remains. Starch grains and phytoliths recovered from teeth indicate consumption of grasses, legumes, and other plants. Some sites in Mediterranean regions show evidence of pine nuts and other collected plant foods. The extent to which plant resources contributed to Neanderthal diets likely varied by region and season, with greater reliance on hunting in northern areas and more diverse diets in southern regions, where plant resources were more abundant year-round. Neanderthals manufactured hafted tools by attaching stone points to wooden shafts, using adhesives made from birch bark tar or other natural resins. This technology required multi-step processing and indicates planning and technical knowledge. Wooden spears have been preserved at sites such as Schöningen in Germany and Leringen, demonstrating that Neanderthals produced sophisticated hunting weapons. The Schöningen spears, though predating classic Neanderthals, show continuity in wooden weapon manufacture into the Neanderthal period. Fire use was regular and controlled among Neanderthal populations. Hearths with organized arrangements of stones and accumulated ash deposits appear at many sites. Fire provided warmth, light, and a means of cooking food, which would have improved digestibility and nutritional value. Some researchers have suggested that Neanderthals used fire to process birch bark for adhesives and to harden wooden spear points, though direct evidence for these activities is limited. Burial of the dead occurred at several Neanderthal sites, though the interpretation of these burials remains debated. La Chapelle aux Saints, La Ferracie, Kibara Cave, and Shanidar Cave have yielded skeletons in positions suggesting deliberate placement. Some bodies were found in shallow pits with stones arranged around or over them. The Shanidar Cave burials initially were thought to include flower offerings based on pollen concentrations, but subsequent analysis has questioned this interpretation, suggesting that pollen may have been introduced by natural processes or burrowing animals. The presence of grave goods or elaborate burial rituals among Neanderthals is not clearly demonstrated. Most burials lack associated artifacts beyond a few stone tools that may represent incidental inclusions rather than intentional offerings. The motivations for burial, whether practical, social, or symbolic, cannot be definitively determined from the archaeological evidence. Some researchers argue that burial reflects symbolic thought and concern for the dead, while others suggest it may have served primarily hygienic or practical purposes. Evidence for symbolic behavior among Neanderthals includes the use of pigments, possible ornaments, and rare instances of engraved objects. Ochre and manganese dioxide have been found at numerous sites, though their specific uses remain unclear. Some pieces show evidence of grinding or scraping, suggesting preparation for application. Perforated shells and animal teeth that may have been used as beads or pendants have been recovered from late Neanderthal sites, particularly those dating to periods when modern humans were present in adjacent regions. The debate over Neanderthal cognitive capabilities centers on whether they possessed fully modern symbolic thought and language. Some researchers point to the complexity of Mysterian technology, evidence of care for injured individuals, and burial practices as indicators of sophisticated cognition. Others argue that Neanderthal behavior was fundamentally different from that of modern humans, lacking the fully symbolic culture evidenced by cave art, elaborate ornaments, and complex social networks that characterize the Upper Paleolithic. Neanderthal population densities were low throughout their range, with estimates suggesting that Europe may have supported only a few tens of thousands of individuals at any given time. Group sizes probably ranged from 20 to 50 individuals organized in mobile bands. Territorial ranges would have been large, particularly in resource-poor environments. Some researchers have proposed that Neanderthal populations were fragmented into isolated groups during glacial periods, leading to genetic bottlenecks and reduced genetic diversity. Genetic evidence from ancient DNA extracted from Neanderthal fossils has revealed that interbreeding occurred between Neanderthals and modern humans. Non-African modern human populations carry approximately 1 to 2% Neanderthal ancestry, indicating gene flow during periods of contact. The timing and location of this interbreeding remain subjects of research, with evidence suggesting multiple episodes of contact in Western Asia and possibly Europe. The relationship between Neanderthals and the environment was dynamic, with populations contracting into southern refugia during glacial maxima and expanding northward during warmer periods. Sites in southern Spain, Italy, and the Balkans show evidence of continuous or repeated occupation through cold phases, suggesting these areas served as refugia where populations persisted. Northern regions appear to have been abandoned during the coldest periods and recolonized when conditions improved. Neanderthals disappeared from the archaeological record by approximately 40,000 years ago, with the latest reliably dated sites in southern Iberia and possibly Gibraltar. The causes of Neanderthal extinction remain debated, with proposed explanations including climate change, competition with modern humans, assimilation through interbreeding, disease, and demographic factors. No single explanation has gained universal acceptance, and multiple factors likely contributed to their disappearance across different regions and time periods. Anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, entered Europe approximately 45,000 to 43,000 years ago, based on radiocarbon dates from early Upper Paleolithic sites and human remains. These populations originated in Africa and had already spread across the Near East and into Western Asia before moving into Europe. The initial entry routes likely followed the Danube corridor into Central Europe and coastal routes along the Mediterranean. Genetic evidence indicates that the founding populations were relatively small, with subsequent population growth and diversification occurring within Europe. The earliest reliably dated modern human remains in Europe include specimens from sites such as Pestera cu Oase in Romania, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, and Grotta del Cavallo in Italy, where modern human teeth have been dated to around 45,000 years ago. The Oase fossils show some morphological features that have been interpreted as evidence of Neanderthal admixture, consistent with genetic data indicating interbreeding between the two populations. Other early sites with modern human remains include Bacho Kiro Cave in Bulgaria and Willendorf in Austria. The initial Upper Paleolithic represents the earliest phase of modern human occupation in Europe, characterized by transitional technologies that combine Middle Paleolithic elements with new tool forms. Assemblages from this period include leaf-shaped points, bone tools, and personal ornaments not typically found in Mousterian contexts. Sites such as Boker Tahtit in the Levant and Bachokirian assemblages in Bulgaria document this technological transition. The relationship between initial Upper Paleolithic industries and subsequent Aurignacian traditions remains debated, with some researchers viewing them as a developmental sequence and others suggesting they represent different population movements. The Aurignacian tradition, named after the site of Aurignac in France, emerged around 43,000 years ago and spread rapidly across Europe. Aurignacian assemblages are characterized by blade and bladelet production, end scrapers, burins, and distinctive bone and antler tools including split-base points. This technology represents a significant departure from Middle Paleolithic traditions in both manufacturing techniques and tool diversity. Aurignacian sites are widely distributed from Spain to Russia, suggesting rapid population expansion or cultural diffusion across the continent. Personal ornaments become abundant in Aurignacian contexts, including perforated shells, animal teeth, ivory beads, and carved pendants. These items appear in large numbers at sites such as Geisenklösterle and Hohle Fels in Germany, where hundreds of beads have been recovered. The widespread use of ornaments suggests that modern humans placed significant emphasis on personal adornment and possibly social signaling through material culture. The sourcing of marine shells at inland sites indicates exchange networks spanning hundreds of kilometers. Figurative art appears early in the Aurignacian record. Carved ivory figurines from German sites include representations of animals such as mammoths, horses, and lions, as well as anthropomorphic figures. The Lion Man figurine from Hohenstein-Stadel, dated to approximately 40,000 years ago, stands over 30 centimeters tall and represents a composite human lion form. Such objects required significant time investment and technical skill to produce, suggesting they held importance beyond purely utilitarian functions. Musical instruments also appear in Aurignacian contexts. Bone flutes made from bird bones and mammoth ivory have been found at several German sites, with perforations carefully placed to produce multiple notes. The presence of these instruments indicates that music or sound production was part of early Upper Paleolithic culture. The social contexts in which these instruments were used cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone, though researchers have proposed various scenarios involving ritual, communication, or entertainment. Cave art begins during the Aurignacian period, with the earliest dated examples appearing around 40,000 years ago. Chauvet Cave in France contains paintings of lions, rhinoceroses, mammoths, and other animals executed in charcoal and red ochre. Radiocarbon dates from charcoal used in the paintings indicate that some images were created around 36,000 to 37,000 years ago, making Chauvet one of the oldest decorated caves known. The artistic sophistication evident at Chauvet, including the use of shading and perspective, has challenged earlier assumptions that cave art developed gradually from simple to complex forms. Hand stencils and geometric signs appear alongside figurative images in many caves. These marks were created by blowing pigment around hands placed against cave walls, producing negative images. Abstract signs including dots, lines, and shapes are found in numerous decorated caves, sometimes in panels separate from animal images. The meanings of these signs remain unknown, though various interpretations have been proposed involving symbolic notation, territory marking, or ritual significance. The distribution of decorated caves is uneven across Europe, with high concentrations in southwestern France and northern Spain. Other regions with Upper Paleolithic populations show little or no cave art, raising questions about regional cultural differences and the functions that decorated caves served. Some researchers have suggested that decorated caves were used for ritual or ceremonial purposes by groups gathered from wider territories, while others propose that they served as information stores or territorial markers. Aurignacian settlement patterns show use of both cave sites and open-air locations. Substantial open-air sites such as Kremswachtberg in Austria have yielded evidence of structures including post holes and hearths arranged in organized patterns. These findings indicate that modern humans constructed shelters and established base camps in favorable locations. The distribution of sites suggests that populations concentrated in river valleys and areas with abundant game, while high-altitude and marginal environments were used less intensively or seasonally. Subsistence strategies during the Aurignacian continued to focus on hunting large mammals, with reindeer, red deer, horses, and bison representing primary prey species. Faunal assemblages show evidence of selective transport of high-value body parts, systematic butchery, and bone marrow extraction. Some sites show evidence of mass kills or seasonal hunting events, suggesting that groups could coordinate activities to exploit animal migrations or aggregations. Fishing and bird hunting also occurred, though these activities are less well documented in the archaeological record. The Gravettian tradition succeeded the Aurignacian around 33,000 years ago and lasted until approximately 24,000 years ago. Gravettian assemblages are characterized by backed blades and points, burins, and distinctive Venus figurines. This tradition shows greater regional variation than the Aurignacian, with different tool types and styles predominating in Eastern, Central, and Western Europe. The geographic extent of Gravettian sites stretched from the Atlantic coast to Russia, encompassing diverse environmental zones. Venus figurines represent a distinctive element of Gravettian material culture. These carved representations of female forms, typically between 5 and 25 centimeters tall, emphasize breasts, hips, and abdomens while showing less detail in faces and extremities. Examples include the Venus of Willendorf from Austria, the Venus of Dolny Věstonice from the Czech Republic, and numerous others found across Europe. The functions and meanings of these figurines remain subjects of debate, with proposed interpretations ranging from fertility symbols to self-portraits to teaching aids. Gravettian burials show evidence of elaborate treatment of the dead. The site of Sungir in Russia contains burials of adults and children accompanied by thousands of ivory beads, carved pendants, and other grave goods. Bodies were placed in extended positions and covered with ochre. The investment of labor represented by the grave goods suggests complex mortuary practices and possibly social differentiation. Other Gravettian burials at sites such as Dolny Věstonice and Przedmosty show similar patterns of elaborate treatment. Mammoth bone structures appear at several Gravettian sites in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine and Russia. These structures consist of mammoth bones and tusks arranged in circular or oval patterns, interpreted as foundations for dwellings covered with hides or other perishable materials. Sites such as Mezirich and Mézin contain multiple structures with associated hearths and artifact concentrations. The construction of these dwellings required significant labor investment and indicates that some Gravettian groups established substantial residential bases. The appearance and rapid spread of modern humans across Europe coincided with or shortly preceded the disappearance of Neanderthals. Whether modern humans directly caused Neanderthal extinction through competition, violence, or disease transmission, or whether Neanderthals were already declining due to other factors, remains debated. Archaeological evidence shows temporal and geographic overlap between the two populations, lasting several thousand years in some regions, suggesting that direct interaction occurred. Upper Paleolithic subsistence in Europe centered on hunting large herbivores, supplemented by smaller game, fish, birds, and plant resources. The specific animals targeted varied by region and time period, reflecting both environmental availability and cultural preferences. Reindeer dominated faunal assemblages at many sites in northern and central Europe, particularly during colder phases when tundra and steppe environments prevailed. Red deer, ibex, and chamois were more common in southern and mountainous regions. Horses and bison appear consistently across broad areas, while mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses were exploited opportunistically where present. Evidence from kill sites and butchery locations indicates that hunting was organized and systematic. The site of Solutré in France contains remains of tens of thousands of horses accumulated over millennia, suggesting repeated use of favorable hunting locations. Similar accumulations appear at other sites, including mammoth bone beds in Eastern Europe and reindeer kill sites in Germany. Whether these accumulations resulted from driving animals over cliffs, ambushing them at natural choke points, or other hunting methods remains debated. Cut marks and fracture patterns on bones show that carcasses were systematically processed, with meat removed, bones broken for marrow, and hides likely taken for use. Seasonal hunting patterns are evident at some sites. The presence of fetal bones or newborn remains indicates spring kills, while antler growth stages and tooth eruption patterns provide information about autumn or winter hunting events. Some locations show evidence of occupation during specific seasons, suggesting that groups moved between sites following animal migrations or exploiting seasonally available resources. Other sites contain evidence of year-round or repeated occupation, indicating more stable settlement patterns in resource-rich areas. Hunting technology included projectile weapons capable of killing large animals at distance. Spear points found in animal bones demonstrate that hunting weapons could penetrate deeply enough to cause fatal injuries. The development of the atlatl, or spear thrower, during the Upper Paleolithic increased projectile velocity and range, making hunting more efficient and safer. Atlatl hooks made from antler or bone have been recovered from multiple sites, and some cave art depicts what may be spear throwers in use. The bow and arrow may have appeared late in the Upper Paleolithic, though definitive evidence is limited and contested. Trapping and snaring likely contributed to subsistence, though direct evidence is rare due to poor preservation of organic materials. Small carnivores such as foxes and Arctic foxes appear in faunal assemblages with damage patterns, suggesting they were trapped for fur rather than food. The presence of complete or nearly complete skeletons of certain species has led researchers to suggest that pitfall traps or deadfalls were used. Nets made from plant fibers or sinew could have been employed for capturing birds or fish, though no Upper Paleolithic examples have been preserved. Fishing became increasingly important during the Upper Paleolithic, particularly at sites near rivers, lakes, and coasts. Fish bones appear in assemblages from sites across Europe, with salmon, trout, pike, and other species represented. Barbed bone and antler points that may have served as fish spears or harpoons have been found at numerous sites. The Magdalenian period, which began around 17,000 years ago, shows particularly abundant evidence of fishing technology, including elaborate harpoons with multiple barbs designed to prevent prey from escaping once struck. Birds were hunted for meat and feathers, with ptarmigan, grouse, waterfowl, and raptors appearing in faunal assemblages. Wing bones from large birds were used to manufacture flutes and other tools, indicating that birds were processed and their body parts utilized. The hunting of specific bird species for feathers used in personal adornment or ritual contexts has been proposed, though direct evidence is circumstantial. Bird bones showing cut marks indicate systematic butchery similar to that practiced on mammals. Plant resources contributed to Upper Paleolithic diets, though preservation biases mean that this contribution is difficult to quantify. Starch grains recovered from grinding stones indicate that seeds, nuts, and other plant parts were processed. Charred plant remains from hearths at some sites include hazelnuts, acorns, and wild grass seeds. The seasonal availability of plant resources would have required knowledge of local landscapes and timing of harvests. Some researchers have suggested that plant foods provided critical calories and nutrients, particularly during seasons when hunting was less productive. Processing plant foods often required substantial labor. Grinding stones, including handstones and slabs, appear at Upper Paleolithic sites, indicating that hard seeds or other materials were reduced to flour or paste. This processing would have improved digestibility and allowed exploitation of otherwise indigestible resources. The effort invested in processing suggests that these foods were sufficiently valuable to warrant the time and energy required. Some plant foods also required removal of toxins through leaching or cooking, adding additional processing steps. Storage of food may have occurred during the Upper Paleolithic, allowing groups to buffer against seasonal scarcity. The concentration of resources at some sites has led researchers to propose that meat was dried, smoked, or frozen for later use. In cold climates, natural freezing would have preserved meat through winter months. Pits at some sites have been interpreted as storage features, though distinguishing storage pits from other types of features is often difficult. Fat and bone marrow, which have high caloric content and preserve well, may have been particularly important stored resources. Exchange networks moved materials and possibly finished goods across substantial distances. Marine shells from the Mediterranean and Atlantic appear at sites hundreds of kilometers inland, indicating either direct travel to coasts or exchange relationships connecting coastal and interior populations. High-quality stone materials such as flint also moved long distances from source areas to sites where they were used. Amber from Baltic sources appears in Central European sites, and obsidian from volcanic sources in the Mediterranean region reached sites far from its origin points. The organization of exchange systems cannot be directly determined from archaeological evidence. Materials may have moved through down-the-line trade, in which items passed between neighboring groups, or through direct procurement, in which people traveled to sources themselves. The presence of complete tool production sequences at some sites indicates that raw materials were imported and worked locally, while other sites show evidence of importing finished tools. Personal relationships, alliance networks, and gift-giving may have motivated material exchanges as much as or more than utilitarian needs. Division of labor likely existed within Upper Paleolithic groups, though the specific allocation of tasks cannot be definitively established. Skeletal evidence of injuries and wear patterns suggests that some individuals engaged in physically demanding activities, while others may have focused on different tasks. The production of elaborate art objects, ornaments, and complex tools would have required specialized knowledge and skill, suggesting that some individuals developed expertise in particular crafts. Whether this specialization was formalized or remained flexible is unknown. Cooperation in hunting large dangerous animals would have been advantageous and possibly necessary. Coordinated drives, ambushes, or surrounds would have required communication and planning among multiple participants. The processing of large carcasses also would have benefited from multiple individuals working together. Evidence of mass kills and the transport of selected body parts suggests that decisions about resource allocation were made collectively, though the mechanisms of decision-making are not preserved in the archaeological record. Resource variability across landscapes influenced settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Groups in resource-rich river valleys or coastal areas may have been able to maintain smaller territories and reduced mobility compared to populations in resource-poor environments. The availability of predictable resources, such as salmon runs or reindeer migrations, allowed planning and preparation for intensive exploitation during specific times of year. Less predictable resources required greater flexibility and broader knowledge of alternative food sources. Hunting constituted the primary source of animal protein for Upper Paleolithic populations across Europe. Reindeer dominated faunal assemblages at sites in northern and central regions, particularly during cold phases when these animals migrated across open tundra and steppe environments. Sites such as Pinsevent in France and Stellmore in Germany show evidence of specialized reindeer hunting during autumn migrations, with large accumulations of bones representing mass kill events. Analysis of tooth eruption patterns and antler development indicates that hunters targeted herds at specific times of year when animals were in optimal condition. Red deer were exploited extensively in forested and mixed environments, particularly in southern and western Europe. Sites in the Dordogne region of France and the Cantabrian coast of Spain show high frequencies of red deer remains throughout stratigraphic sequences. Horse hunting occurred across much of Europe, with concentrations of horse bones at sites such as Solutré in France, where hundreds of individuals are represented in deposits spanning thousands of years. The mechanisms by which horses were hunted remain debated, with proposed methods including driving animals over cliffs, corralling them in natural traps, or ambushing individuals or small groups. Large bovids, including bison and aurochs, were hunted when available, though these animals appear less frequently in faunal assemblages than cervids or horses. Mammoth and woolly rhinoceros remains occur at some sites, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, though whether these animals were actively hunted or primarily scavenged remains uncertain. Cut marks on mammoth bones indicate that humans processed these carcasses, but the massive size and dangerous nature of living mammoths would have made them challenging prey. Ibex and chamois hunting occurred in mountainous regions, with sites in the Alps, Pyrenees, and Caucasus showing evidence of specialized exploitation of these animals. Hunters pursued ibex in steep, rocky terrain where these animals sought refuge. The presence of ibex remains at high-altitude rock shelters suggests that hunting groups made seasonal trips into mountain zones to exploit these resources. Bone accumulations at some sites indicate repeated use of particular hunting locations over long time periods. Small game exploitation included hares, rabbits, birds, and fish, though these resources are underrepresented in many faunal assemblages due to preservation biases and recovery methods. Sites where fine screening and flotation have been employed show higher frequencies of small animal remains. Grotta Romanelli in Italy and other Mediterranean sites contain abundant remains of birds and fish, indicating that coastal populations diversified their diets to include smaller prey. The use of nets, traps, or snares for capturing small animals is suggested by ethnographic parallels, but cannot be definitively demonstrated from archaeological evidence. Bird hunting focused on species such as ptarmigan, grouse, waterfowl, and raptors. Ptarmigan bones appear frequently at northern sites during cold periods, while waterfowl remains are more common at sites near rivers and wetlands. Raptor bones showing cut marks have been found at several sites, suggesting that large birds were killed for feathers or talons, rather than primarily for meat. Eagle talons bearing cut marks and polish have been interpreted as components of ornaments or tools. Fishing intensified during the Upper Paleolithic, particularly in later phases. Fish remains including salmon, pike, and eels have been recovered from sites along major rivers. Coastal sites contain bones of marine fish, such as cod and other species, that indicate offshore fishing activities. The methods used for fishing likely included spears, traps, and nets, though direct evidence for fishing technology is limited. Bone points interpreted as fish spears or harpoons appear in late Upper Paleolithic contexts, and net weights made of stone have been found at some sites. Shellfish collection occurred along both marine and freshwater shorelines. Marine shells transported inland appear as ornaments, but shells accumulated in large quantities at coastal sites indicate consumption as food. Limpets, mussels, and other mollusks were gathered and processed, though their caloric contribution to diets was probably limited compared to terrestrial game. Freshwater mollusks were also collected from rivers and lakes, with shell accumulations appearing at some inland sites. Plant resources contributed to Upper Paleolithic diets, though preservation biases limit direct evidence. Grinding stones, including mortars and pestles, appear at some sites, suggesting processing of seeds, nuts, or other plant materials. Starch grains and phytoliths recovered from grinding tools and dental calculus indicate consumption of various plant species, including grasses, legumes, and roots. Hazelnuts, acorns, and pine nuts were exploited where available, with charred nutshells preserved at some sites. Storage of food resources may have occurred, though archaeological evidence is limited. Permafrost conditions in northern regions would have allowed natural refrigeration of meat, and some researchers have suggested that pits found at sites such as Mejirich may have served as cold storage facilities. Preservation of plant resources through drying or other methods is ethnographically documented among recent hunter-gatherers, but leaves little archaeological trace. The seasonal abundance of certain resources, particularly during animal migrations or plant harvest seasons, would have created opportunities for storage and delayed consumption. Seasonal mobility characterized most Upper Paleolithic groups, with movements timed to exploit resources as they became available in different locations. Residential sites occupied during winter months typically show evidence of substantial structures and diverse activities, while short-term camps used during other seasons contain fewer features and more restricted artifact assemblages. The distances traveled between seasonal camps varied by region and resource distribution, with some groups moving hundreds of kilometers annually, while others circulated within more restricted territories. Labor investment in food procurement varied by resource type and environmental context. Hunting large mammals required tracking, stalking, and coordinated action, followed by butchery and transport of meat and other products. Processing plant resources through grinding or cooking also demanded time and effort, particularly for resources requiring removal of toxins or hard protective coverings. The relative efficiency of different subsistence strategies depended on resource density, predictability, and the time required for acquisition and processing. Exchange networks linked groups across considerable distances, with movement of materials such as marine shells, high-quality stone, amber, and fossils. Shell ornaments from Mediterranean sources appear at sites hundreds of kilometers inland, while Baltic amber traveled southward into Central Europe. Obsidian and high-quality flint were transported over distances exceeding 200 kilometers in some cases. These movements indicate either direct acquisition through long-distance travel or indirect exchange through multiple intermediaries. The organization of exchange systems remains unclear from archaeological evidence alone. Materials may have moved through reciprocal gift-giving, trade relationships, intermarriage between groups, or periodic gatherings where exchange occurred. The appearance of similar artifact styles and raw materials across wide geographic areas suggests communication and interaction between populations, though the specific mechanisms and social contexts cannot be definitively determined. Ochre and other pigments circulated through exchange networks, with some sources being exploited intensively and materials transported over substantial distances. High-quality ochre deposits were quarried at specific locations, with evidence of mining and processing activities. The widespread use of pigments in contexts including body decoration, hide processing, and cave painting created demand for these materials. Manganese dioxide also was collected and transported, though its sources are less well documented than ochre deposits. Ivory from mammoth tusks served as a raw material for tools, ornaments, and art objects. The transport of ivory tusks or worked ivory pieces over long distances indicates that this material had value beyond its local availability. Some researchers have suggested that ivory objects served as prestige goods or items of exchange between groups. The labor required to work ivory into finished products was substantial, adding to the value of completed items. Food sharing within and between groups is suggested by ethnographic parallels and by the distribution of faunal remains at archaeological sites. Large prey animals provided more meat than small groups could consume before spoilage, creating opportunities for sharing and establishing reciprocal relationships. The locations of butchery activities and distributions of body parts at sites indicate that processing and consumption involved multiple individuals and possibly multiple residential units. Stone tool production during the Upper Paleolithic involved systematic blade and bladelet manufacture from carefully prepared cores. Blade technology produced elongated flakes with parallel edges struck from cylindrical or conical cores. This method generated multiple standardized blanks from a single core, increasing efficiency compared to earlier flaking techniques. Bladelet production created even smaller elongated pieces that could be hafted in series to create composite tools with working edges longer than single stone implements could provide. Core preparation techniques varied by tradition and raw material characteristics. Prismatic cores were shaped to create a striking platform at one end and a convex working surface from which parallel blades could be detached. The angle between platform and working surface required precise control to ensure successful blade removal. Cores were rotated during reduction to maintain proper angles and surface convexity. Exhausted cores show evidence of multiple platform preparations and rejuvenation flakes removed to restore working surfaces. Pressure flaking appeared during the Solutrean period, approximately 24,000 to 19,000 years ago. This technique involved applying controlled pressure with bone or antler tools to remove thin flakes from stone surfaces, allowing production of finely worked bifacial points with regular, flat surfaces. Solutrean laurel leaf points and shouldered points demonstrate sophisticated control of fracture mechanics and represent some of the most refined lithic work in the Paleolithic record. The production of these points required high-quality raw materials and considerable skill. Burin production became standardized during the Upper Paleolithic. Burins are tools with chisel-like working edges created by removing narrow spalls from the end or side of a blade or flake. These tools served multiple functions, including engraving, grooving, and working bone, antler, and ivory. Burin spalls, the waste flakes removed during burin manufacture, accumulate in large numbers at some sites, indicating intensive production activities. Different burin types are recognized based on the position and angle of the working edge. End scrapers featured retouched edges at the distal ends of blades or flakes. These tools were used for hide processing, woodworking, and other scraping tasks. Microscopic examination of scraper edges shows polish and striations consistent with working various materials. Some scrapers were hafted in wooden or bone handles, allowing more controlled application of force. Scrapers occur in high frequencies at most Upper Paleolithic sites, suggesting that scraping activities were common and repetitive. Backed blades and points were created by blunting one edge through steep retouch, producing implements that could be hafted without cutting binding materials or causing hand injuries. Gravettian assemblages contain numerous backed pieces, including gravette points, microgravettes, and backed bladelets. These tools likely served as projectile points, knife blades, or inserts in composite tools. Experiments with replicas have demonstrated that backed pieces function effectively as arrow and spear armatures. Bone and antler working intensified during the Upper Paleolithic, with production of points, awls, needles, and decorative objects. Manufacturing techniques included grinding, scraping, polishing, and grooving. Antler was often worked by cutting grooves along the desired split line, then applying force to separate sections. Bone was shaped through scraping and grinding, sometimes after heating to make the material more workable. Needles with drilled eyes appear in late Upper Paleolithic contexts, indicating production of sewn clothing. Split-base bone points characterize Aurignacian assemblages. These projectile points have longitudinal grooves or splits at the base, possibly for hafting onto shafts. Manufacturing these points required careful shaping and splitting of bone or antler blanks. Some points show impact fractures consistent with use as projectiles. The function of the basal split remains debated, with proposed explanations including improved hafting, shock absorption, or facilitation of shaft insertion. Eyed needles represent a significant technological innovation appearing around 25,000 years ago. These implements, typically 5 to 10 centimeters long, with carefully drilled eyes, enabled production of tailored clothing with sewn seams. The drilling of eyes required specialized tools and techniques to create holes without breaking the needle shaft. The appearance of needles coincides with evidence of more intensive use of northern environments, suggesting that improved clothing technology facilitated occupation of cold regions. Spear throwers, or atlatls, increased the velocity and range of projectiles. These devices consisted of hooked implements that extended the throwing arm, providing mechanical advantage. Carved and decorated spear throwers appear in Magdalenian contexts, with examples from sites such as Mas d'Azil and Le Mas d'Azil in France. The hooks were carved from antler or bone, sometimes featuring elaborate animal figures. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that spear throwers significantly increase projectile force and accuracy compared to hand-thrown spears. Harpoons with detachable heads emerged during the late Upper Paleolithic. These implements featured barbed bone or antler points attached to lines, allowing hunters to maintain connection with struck prey. Single-row and double-row barbed harpoons appear in Magdalenian assemblages, particularly at sites where fishing and sea mammal hunting occurred. The manufacture of harpoons required careful shaping of barbs and preparation of attachment points. Some harpoons show evidence of repair and resharpening, indicating curation and reuse. Rope and cordage production is indicated by twisted fiber impressions, preserved in fired clay at sites such as Dolny Vestonice and Pavlov. These impressions show 2-ply and 3-ply twisted cords made from plant fibers. Cordage would have served multiple purposes, including binding, nets, snares, and carrying devices. The preservation of fiber artifacts is extremely rare, but the clay impressions demonstrate that sophisticated fiber technology existed by at least 25,000 years ago. Hafting technologies attached stone and bone implements to handles using various binding materials and adhesives. Birch bark tar, produced by heating birch bark in the absence of oxygen, served as an effective adhesive. Residues of birch tar have been found on stone tools and as separate lumps bearing impressions of fingers and tools. Animal sinews, plant fibers, and hide strips also served as binding materials. Some hafted implements show evidence of mastic composed of resin, mixed with ochre or charcoal, to improve adhesive properties. Grinding stones for processing plant materials include flat grinding slabs, handstones, mortars, and pestles. These tools appear sporadically in Upper Paleolithic contexts, with greater frequencies at some sites than others. The surfaces of grinding stones show polish and residues from processed materials. Use-wear analysis indicates that grinding stones processed both plant materials and mineral pigments. The investment in manufacturing and maintaining grinding equipment suggests that processed plant foods contributed meaningfully to diets at some locations. Lamps made from limestone or sandstone slabs with shallow depressions held animal fat and fiber wicks, providing portable light sources. Hundreds of lamps have been recovered from French and Spanish caves, including decorated examples from Lascaux and other sites. Experiments with replica lamps demonstrate that they produce sufficient light for movement through caves and execution of artwork. Soot deposits on cave ceilings above some painted panels indicate that lamps or torches were used during painting activities. Pigment processing involved grinding ochre, manganese dioxide, and other minerals into powders that could be mixed with binders for application. Grinding stones with pigment residues and prepared ochre cakes show evidence of standardized processing activities. Some sites contain concentrations of pigment materials, along with processing tools, suggesting dedicated workshops or repeated processing events. The preparation of pigments required knowledge of mineral sources, processing techniques, and appropriate binders. Fire-making technologies likely included percussion methods using iron pyrites or similar minerals, and friction methods using wooden implements. Direct evidence for fire-making equipment is rare, but several sites have yielded pyrite nodules with percussion marks. Tinder materials such as dried grasses, fungi, or shredded bark would have been necessary to catch and nurture sparks into flames. The ability to create fire on demand provided significant advantages for warmth, cooking, and tool manufacture. Wooden implements rarely preserve but occasionally appear in waterlogged or frozen contexts. Wooden spears, throwing sticks, and digging implements are documented from a few exceptional sites. The working of wood required stone and bone tools for cutting, scraping, and shaping. Fire was sometimes used to harden wooden points or to facilitate working of wood. The scarcity of preserved wooden artifacts in the archaeological record means that an entire category of material culture remains largely invisible. Ceramic technology appeared briefly during the Gravettian period at sites in the Czech Republic, including Dolní Věstonice and Pavlov. Figurines of animals and humans were modeled from clay mixed with bone ash and fired at temperatures between 500 and 800 degrees Celsius. Thousands of ceramic fragments represent fired clay objects, though ceramic vessels do not appear until much later periods. The purpose of these early ceramic figurines remains unclear, though their frequent fragmentation has led to suggestions of ritual destruction. The Pleistocene epoch ended approximately 11,700 years ago, marked by the transition from glacial to interglacial conditions that characterize the Holocene. This transition followed the last glacial maximum, which occurred between 26,000 and 19,000 years ago, when ice sheets reached their maximum extent across northern Europe. Temperatures during the last glacial maximum averaged 5 to 10 degrees Celsius lower than present, with regional variations depending on latitude and proximity to ice margins. Sea levels stood approximately 120 meters below current levels, exposing extensive continental shelves and land bridges. The retreat of ice sheets began around 19,000 years ago and proceeded unevenly, with periods of rapid warming interrupted by cold reversals. The Böhling-Allerud interstadial, from approximately 14,700 to 12,900 years ago, brought significant warming across Europe. Temperatures rose rapidly, approaching or even briefly exceeding modern levels in some regions. Vegetation responded quickly to warming, with tree species, including birch and pine, colonizing previously treeless landscapes. Archaeological evidence shows that human populations expanded northward during this warm phase, reoccupying areas that had been abandoned or sparsely inhabited during the glacial maximum. The Younger Dryas cold reversal, from approximately 12,900 to 11,700 years ago, interrupted the warming trend. Temperatures dropped sharply, approaching glacial conditions in northern regions. This cold phase lasted roughly 1,200 years and caused significant environmental disruptions. Tree cover retreated and tundra vegetation expanded once again across much of northern Europe. The causes of the Younger Dryas remain debated, with proposed mechanisms including disruption of ocean circulation by meltwater influx, changes in solar radiation, or volcanic activity. Human populations responded to Younger Dryas cooling through shifts in settlement patterns and subsistence strategies. Some northern areas were abandoned as conditions became less favorable. Sites in southern refugia show evidence of continued occupation, while populations concentrated in environmentally favorable locations with reliable resources. The archaeological record shows changes in stone tool technologies during this period, with the emergence of geometric microliths and other innovations that characterize the terminal Paleolithic and early Mesolithic periods. The final termination of the Younger Dryas marked the beginning of the Holocene interglacial approximately 11,700 years ago. Warming occurred rapidly, with temperatures rising several degrees within decades. Ice sheets continued retreating, and sea levels rose as meltwater returned to the oceans. The environmental changes were dramatic and affected landscapes, vegetation, animal distributions, and human adaptations across Europe. Forests expanded rapidly across formerly open landscapes, fundamentally altering the character of available habitats and resources. Vegetation succession followed predictable patterns as climate warmed. Pioneer species including birch, willow, and juniper colonized open ground first, followed by pine and hazel. Deciduous trees including oak, elm, and lime expanded from southern refugia into Central and Northern Europe over several millennia. The rate of forest expansion varied by region, with some areas experiencing rapid afforestation while others remained open for longer periods. Pollen records from lake sediments document these changes in detail, showing the timing and sequence of vegetation shifts. Animal populations shifted in response to changing habitats. Cold-adapted species including reindeer, woolly mammoth, and woolly rhinoceros retreated northward or became extinct. Temperate species including red deer, wild boar, and aurochs expanded their ranges into newly forested regions. Elk and roe deer became more abundant in many areas. Bird populations changed as wetlands expanded and forest cover increased. Fish species composition in rivers and lakes adjusted to warming water temperatures and changing aquatic habitats. Megafaunal extinctions occurred during the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene, eliminating many large mammal species. Woolly mammoths disappeared from mainland Europe by approximately 10,000 years ago, though isolated populations persisted on islands until much later. Woolly rhinoceroses, giant deer, and cave bears also became extinct during this period. The causes of these extinctions remain debated, with proposed factors including climate change, human hunting pressure, habitat loss, and combinations of multiple stressors. The relative importance of each factor likely varied by species and region. Sea level rise flooded coastal plains and continental shelves as glacial meltwater entered the oceans. The rate of rise varied through time, with periods of rapid increase alternating with slower phases. Doggerland, the land bridge connecting Britain to continental Europe, was progressively inundated between approximately 10,000 and 8,000 years ago. The North Sea basin filled, creating new marine habitats and eliminating formerly terrestrial landscapes. Coastal archaeological sites from the terminal Pleistocene and early Holocene were destroyed or submerged, creating gaps in the archaeological record. River systems responded to changing precipitation patterns and ice sheet melting. Stream flows increased during periods of rapid ice retreat, altering channel morphology and flooding patterns. Sediment loads changed as vegetation cover stabilized previously exposed surfaces. River valleys that had served as migration corridors during the Pleistocene continued to be important settlement locations, though the specific resources available along rivers shifted with changing climate and vegetation. Lake levels fluctuated in response to changes in precipitation and evaporation rates. Some basins that had been dry during glacial periods filled with water as climate became wetter. Other lakes shrank or disappeared as conditions changed. These fluctuations affected the availability of aquatic resources and influenced where human populations could establish camps. Wetland habitats expanded in many regions, providing new resource opportunities, including waterfowl, fish, and plant foods. The expansion of forest cover fundamentally altered hunting strategies and mobility patterns. Open country hunting techniques effective for pursuing herd animals on treeless landscapes became less applicable in forested environments. Hunters adapted by targeting solitary or small group animals, including red deer, wild boar, and roe deer. The use of bows and arrows increased during this transitional period, providing effective weapons for hunting in forested settings where visual ranges were limited and stalking was necessary. Settlement patterns shifted from the high mobility characteristic of late Paleolithic populations to more localized patterns with repeated use of particular locations. Base camps occupied for longer periods appear more frequently in the archaeological record, along with evidence of specialized task sites. The distribution of sites shows concentration in ecotones between different habitat types, where resource diversity was greatest. Coastal locations, river confluences, and lake shores attracted repeated settlement due to reliable access to multiple resource zones. Tool technologies changed in response to environmental shifts and new subsistence requirements. Geometric microliths. Small stone inserts hafted in series to create composite tools became widespread during the Mesolithic. These tools were effective for arrows and other projectiles used in forested hunting. The reduction in size of lithic implements may reflect conservation of raw materials or functional adaptations to new tool designs. Bone and antler working continued, with innovations including barbed points optimized for fishing and specialized woodworking tools. Resource intensification occurred in some regions as populations adapted to post-glacial environments. Evidence of increased exploitation of plant foods, shellfish, and fish suggests diversification of subsistence strategies. Some coastal populations relied heavily on marine resources, while inland groups focused on riverine and terrestrial foods. The seasonal scheduling of resource acquisition became more complex as the diversity of available resources increased with environmental differentiation. Population densities likely increased during the early Holocene as environmental productivity rose and resource availability became more predictable. The expansion of temperate forests supported larger animal biomass compared to glacial steppe environments. Aquatic resources in rivers, lakes, and coastal zones provided reliable food sources that could support denser human populations. Regional population growth created opportunities for more complex social interactions and possibly increasing territoriality. The pace of cultural change accelerated during the Pleistocene-Holocene transition. New technologies, subsistence strategies, and settlement patterns emerged within relatively short time spans compared to the slower pace of change characteristic of earlier periods. This acceleration reflects both environmental pressures requiring adaptation and possibly increasing population densities that facilitated innovation and information exchange. The archaeological record shows greater regional differentiation in material culture during this period, suggesting that populations were developing distinct local traditions. Climate variability continued throughout the early Holocene, with shorter-term fluctuations affecting local and regional conditions. Cold events, including the 8.2 kilo-year event, caused temporary cooling that disrupted some populations. Droughts, floods, and other extreme events required flexible adaptive strategies. The overall trend toward warmer, more stable conditions facilitated the eventual development of food production economies in some regions, though Europe remained characterized by hunting, gathering, and fishing societies for several millennia into the Holocene. Western Europe, particularly the Atlantic coastal regions and the river valleys of France, shows dense concentrations of Upper Paleolithic sites with extensive evidence of artistic and technological elaboration. The Dordogne region contains numerous decorated caves, including Lascaux, Font de Gaume, and Les Combarelles, along with rock shelter sites that preserve deep stratigraphic sequences spanning multiple cultural periods. The concentration of archaeological sites in this region reflects both favorable preservation conditions and intensive research history, though it also indicates that these areas supported substantial human populations during the Upper Paleolithic. The Cantabrian coast of northern Spain preserves another major concentration of decorated caves, including Altamira, El Castillo, and numerous smaller sites. The coastal location provided access to both marine and terrestrial resources, supporting year-round occupation or seasonal movements between coast and interior. Faunal assemblages from Cantabrian sites show exploitation of red deer, ibex, and marine resources, including shellfish and fish. The artistic traditions of this region show distinctive characteristics, with extensive use of polychrome painting and detailed animal representations. The Pyrenees formed both a barrier and a corridor between Iberian and French populations. High-altitude sites in the Pyrenees show evidence of seasonal occupation by groups exploiting ibex and other mountain resources. Cave sites on both the French and Spanish sides of the mountain range contain Upper Paleolithic deposits, with some showing similar artifact styles suggesting interaction across the mountain barrier. The passes through the Pyrenees would have been accessible during warmer seasons, allowing movement and exchange between regions. The Italian peninsula served as a refugium during glacial maxima, with continuous human occupation in southern regions throughout cold phases. Sites such as Grotta Paglici, Grotta Romanelli, and Riparo Mochi contain Upper Paleolithic deposits with evidence of varied subsistence strategies. The Mediterranean coastline provided marine resources, while interior regions offered terrestrial game. The relative isolation of Italian populations during some periods led to development of distinctive regional traditions, though connections with other Mediterranean regions are evident in shared artifact styles and raw material movements. Central Europe, including modern Germany, Czech Republic, Austria, and Poland, shows evidence of Gravettian settlement concentrated in river valleys and loess plains. The mammoth bone structures of Moravia and Ukraine represent a distinctive adaptation to treeless landscapes with limited natural shelter. Sites such as Dolny Vistonich, Pavlov, and Przedmosti preserve evidence of substantial occupations with elaborate material culture, including ceramic figurines and extensive ivory working. The open-country hunting strategies employed in these regions focused on mammoths, horses, and other large game. The Danube River Valley served as a major corridor for movement and interaction, connecting Central Europe with southeastern regions. Sites along the Danube show evidence of long-distance exchange networks, with marine shells from the Mediterranean and Black Sea appearing at inland locations. The river provided access to diverse resources and facilitated communication between populations separated by considerable distances. Settlement concentrated in favorable locations along the river, with evidence of repeated occupation over thousands of years. Eastern Europe and the Russian plain supported sparse Upper Paleolithic populations that exploited vast territories during favorable climatic periods. Sites such as Kostenki and Sungir preserve evidence of elaborate material culture. Despite the harsh environmental conditions, the open landscapes required different adaptive strategies compared to Western European regions, with greater emphasis on mobility and exploitation of migratory animals. The archaeological record shows periodic abandonment of northern areas during coldest phases, with recolonization during warming trends. The Carpathian Mountains formed another major topographic feature, influencing settlement and movement patterns. Passes through the Carpathians connected the Hungarian plain with regions to the north and south. Cave sites in the Carpathians contain Upper Paleolithic deposits, though the density of sites is lower than in Western European limestone regions. The mountains provided refuge for animals including ibex and chamois, attracting seasonal hunting parties. Southeastern Europe, including the Balkans and Greece, shows evidence of Upper Paleolithic occupation in both cave and open-air contexts. The region's position at the crossroads between Europe and Asia meant that populations here potentially maintained connections with Near Eastern groups. Sites such as Franchthi Cave in Greece contain long sequences spanning from Upper Paleolithic into later periods, documenting environmental changes and human responses. Obsidian from Aegean sources was transported to mainland sites, indicating exchange networks. The British Isles were connected to continental Europe during much of the Upper Paleolithic due to low sea levels. Sites in England and Wales preserve evidence of human occupation during warmer phases, with apparent abandonment during coldest periods. The cave sites of Creswell Crags contain Upper Paleolithic deposits and decorated rock surfaces. The northernmost extent of occupation in Britain fluctuated with climatic conditions, with populations retreating southward or abandoning the region entirely during severe cold phases. Scandinavia remained largely under ice during the last glacial maximum and was uninhabitable until ice retreat began. The earliest evidence of human presence in southern Scandinavia dates to the terminal Pleistocene, as populations expanded northward following retreating ice margins. The colonization of northern regions required adaptations to high-latitude environments, with extreme seasonal variation in daylight and temperature. Archaeological evidence from this late phase shows specialized hunting of reindeer and exploitation of emerging marine and freshwater resources. Regional tool traditions show distinct characteristics reflecting local innovations, raw material availability, and cultural preferences. The Solutrean tradition of southwestern France and Iberia, characterized by finely worked bifacial points, differs markedly from contemporaneous industries in other regions. The Magdalenian tradition that followed the Solutrean shows widespread distribution across Western Europe, but with regional variants distinguished by specific tool types and decorative styles. Eastern European assemblages show different technological emphases, with greater focus on blade and bladelet production from particular core types. Artistic traditions also show regional variation in style, technique, and subject matter. The painted caves of southwestern France and northern Spain represent one distinctive tradition, while the carved and engraved portable art of Central and Eastern Europe represents another. Some regions show little evidence of figurative art despite substantial Upper Paleolithic occupation, raising questions about whether absence of art reflects preservation biases, different cultural practices, or other factors. The distribution of Venus figurines concentrates in certain regions while being absent from others. Exchange networks operated at different scales, from local movements within a few tens of kilometers to long-distance transport spanning hundreds of kilometers. Some materials, such as high-quality flint, moved primarily through local exchange within restricted regions, while other materials, including marine shells and exotic stones, traveled much greater distances. The mechanisms of exchange likely varied, with some materials moving through direct acquisition during seasonal movements, and others passing through multiple hands via down-the-line trade. Population densities varied significantly across Europe, with highest concentrations in resource-rich areas and lowest densities in marginal environments. River valleys, coastal zones, and regions with diverse topography generally supported denser populations than open plains or mountainous areas. The distribution of archaeological sites reflects both actual settlement patterns and preservation biases, making precise population estimates difficult. Researchers have proposed that total Upper Paleolithic population of Europe numbered in the tens of thousands, though considerable uncertainty surrounds such estimates. Social boundaries between regional groups remain difficult to define from archaeological evidence. Distinctive tool styles, ornament types, and artistic traditions suggest cultural differentiation, though whether these differences reflect distinct ethnic or linguistic groups cannot be determined. The extent to which populations maintained separate identities versus interacting freely across regions is debated. Material culture similarities across wide areas suggest communication and interaction, while regional peculiarities indicate some degree of separation or independent development. Coastal adaptations intensified during late Upper Paleolithic and Terminal Pleistocene periods in some regions. Sites along Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts show increasing evidence of marine resource exploitation, including shellfish collection, fishing, and possibly sea mammal hunting. The specialized equipment required for intensive maritime exploitation, including boats, nets, and hooks, would have required significant technological investment. The relative importance of marine versus terrestrial resources varied by location and season. Interior regions far from coasts developed adaptations focused on terrestrial and riverine resources. The steppes and plains of Eastern Europe supported populations that pursued large game across open landscapes. Forest margins and ecotones between different habitat types provided diverse resources that could be exploited from central base camps. The seasonal movements between different resource zones created patterns of aggregation and dispersal as groups came together during abundant seasons and separated during resource-scarce periods. Mountain regions presented challenges including steep terrain, limited shelter, and seasonal inaccessibility, but also offered resources including alpine game, lithic raw materials, and passage routes between lowland areas. High-altitude sites show primarily warm season occupation, suggesting that mountains were used seasonally rather than year-round. The effort required to access mountain resources indicates that these materials or animals held sufficient value to justify the costs of high-altitude travel. Evidence for interpersonal violence during the Paleolithic appears sporadically in the archaeological record. Skeletal remains showing trauma include individuals with healed fractures, embedded projectile points, and perimortem injuries that may represent interpersonal conflict. The cemetery at Jebel Sahaba in Sudan, dating to the Terminal Pleistocene, contains multiple individuals with stone projectile points embedded in bones, suggesting violent deaths. European examples of traumatic injuries are less numerous, but include individuals from sites such as San Teodoro Cave in Sicily, where a young adult male shows evidence of a projectile wound to the pelvis. The frequency and context of violence remain difficult to assess from limited skeletal samples. Most injuries observed on Paleolithic skeletons represent healed fractures that could result from accidents rather than interpersonal aggression. The rarity of definitively violent trauma in the European Paleolithic record suggests that large-scale warfare was uncommon, though this absence could reflect small population sizes and low population densities that limited opportunities for sustained conflict. Sporadic violence between individuals or small groups may have occurred without leaving extensive archaeological traces. Burial practices provide insight into social organization and treatment of the dead. Upper Paleolithic burials show considerable variation in treatment, from simple interments with no accompanying materials to elaborate burials with extensive grave goods. The Sungir burials in Russia represent one of the most elaborate known examples, with adults and children buried with thousands of mammoth ivory beads, carved ornaments, and other artifacts. The labor investment represented by grave goods at Sungir and similar sites suggests that some individuals held special status or that burial practices served important social functions. Multiple burials containing more than one individual occur at several sites. Some represent simultaneous interments of individuals who may have died together, while others show sequential burials in the same location. The relationships between individuals buried together cannot always be determined, though age and sex distributions sometimes suggest family groups. The reuse of burial locations indicates that particular places held significance for disposal of the dead, possibly relating to territorial claims or symbolic associations. Grave goods accompanying burials include personal ornaments, stone tools, bone implements, and animal remains. The quantity and elaboration of grave goods vary substantially between burials, even at single sites. Some individuals are buried with minimal or no accompanying objects, while others have extensive assemblages. Whether these differences reflect social status, age, gender, personal achievements, or other factors remains debated. The presence of elaborate grave goods with children at sites such as Sungir suggests that status could be ascribed rather than achieved, though alternative interpretations are possible. The positioning of bodies in burials shows some patterns, with most individuals placed in flexed or extended positions. The orientation of bodies varies, with no consistent directional preferences evident across sites. Some burials include ochre, either sprinkled over the body or placed in concentrated deposits. The use of ochre in mortuary contexts may have held symbolic significance, though the specific meanings cannot be determined from archaeological evidence alone. Ochre use in burials extends back to Middle Paleolithic times with Neanderthal burials. Personal ornaments provide evidence of individual and group identity. Beads made from shells, animal teeth, ivory, and stone appear in large numbers at Upper Paleolithic sites. The production of beads required considerable labor, with drilling, grinding, and shaping operations leaving distinctive manufacturing traces. Beads were worn as necklaces, bracelets, clothing decorations, and possibly hair ornaments. The standardization of bead types within particular regions suggests shared stylistic preferences or cultural traditions. Shell beads manufactured from marine species appear at sites hundreds of kilometers from coastlines, indicating either long-distance travel or exchange networks. Particular shell species show preferential selection, with some types appearing frequently, while others available in the same coastal environments are rarely used. The selection criteria may have related to shell size, color, shape, or symbolic associations. The transport of shells inland created opportunities for exchange and social interaction between coastal and interior populations. Animal teeth, particularly those of carnivores including fox, wolf, and bear, were perforated and used as pendants. Deer and bovid teeth also appear as ornamental items. The selection of particular species and tooth types suggests deliberate choices based on aesthetic or symbolic criteria. Some teeth show evidence of wear from suspension, indicating extended use. The curation and repair of ornaments demonstrates that these items held value beyond their raw material worth. Ivory ornaments carved from mammoth tusks include beads, pendants, and more elaborate objects. The working of ivory required specialized tools and considerable time investment. Some ivory ornaments feature incised geometric designs or representational images. Bracelets carved from single pieces of ivory or assembled from segments demonstrate sophisticated manufacturing techniques. The distribution of ivory ornaments shows concentration in regions where mammoths were available, though finished pieces traveled through exchange networks. Perforated fossils and unusual stones appear occasionally as ornaments. Fossil shells, echinoids, and other distinctive objects were collected and modified for suspension. The selection of unusual or exotic items suggests that rarity or distinctiveness contributed to value. These objects may have served as conversation pieces or markers of travel to distant locations. The contexts in which such items were deposited provide limited information about their social functions. Evidence for specialized craft production is limited in Paleolithic contexts. Most individuals likely possessed the skills necessary to produce everyday tools and equipment. However, the manufacture of particularly elaborate or technically demanding items, such as finely worked Solutrean points, carved figurines, or complex composite tools, may have involved specialists with enhanced skills. The identification of workshops or activity areas, with concentrations of manufacturing debris suggests that certain locations were used repeatedly for specific production activities. Leadership structures in Paleolithic societies cannot be directly observed from archaeological evidence. Ethnographic studies of recent hunter-gatherer societies show various organizational forms, ranging from egalitarian bands to societies with achieved or inherited leadership positions. The appearance of elaborate burials with differential wealth suggests that some Upper Paleolithic societies may have recognized status distinctions. Whether these distinctions translated into political authority or primarily reflected prestige and respect remains uncertain. Gift exchange likely played important roles in establishing and maintaining social relationships between individuals and groups. The movement of exotic materials over long distances suggests reciprocal exchange networks. Periodic gatherings during seasons of resource abundance would have provided opportunities for exchange, mate selection, information sharing, and social bonding. The timing and locations of such gatherings would have been determined by resource availability and cultural traditions. Territories and group boundaries may have been marked or recognized through various means. The distribution of distinctive artifact styles across particular regions suggests shared cultural traditions that could relate to group identities. Whether groups actively defended territories or primarily recognized customary use areas cannot be determined from archaeological evidence. The overlap of different regional traditions in some areas may indicate boundary zones where different groups interacted. Kinship systems structured social relationships within and between groups. The small size of Paleolithic bands meant that most interactions occurred between relatives or individuals known through extended kin networks. Marriage patterns likely involved exchange of mates between bands to maintain genetic diversity and establish alliances. The specific kinship terminology and marriage rules employed by Paleolithic societies remain unknown and may have varied between regions and time periods. Gender roles and divisions of labor cannot be directly observed from archaeological evidence. Skeletal analyses showing differential patterns of bone development and trauma between males and females suggest that different activities characterized male and female lives. The association of particular artifacts or activities with specific individuals is rarely possible due to poor preservation and limited contexts. Ethnographic parallels suggest various possible patterns of gender-based labor division, though Paleolithic societies may have differed from recent examples. Age-based social distinctions likely existed, with different expectations and roles for children, adults, and elderly individuals. The presence of children's burials with elaborate grave goods suggests that young individuals could hold recognized positions within society. Elderly individuals may have served as repositories of knowledge about territories, resources, technologies, and social relationships. The survival of injured or disabled individuals to advanced ages indicates that groups provided care for non-productive members. Symbolic systems evident in art, ornaments, and burial practices suggest complex cognitive and social capabilities. The standardization of certain motifs across wide geographic areas indicates shared symbolic meanings or conventions. Abstract signs appearing in cave art may represent notation systems, territorial markers, or other forms of symbolic communication. The specific meanings of artistic images and abstract signs remain inaccessible, though various interpretations have been proposed based on ethnographic parallels and contextual analyses. Ritual activities may be indicated by particular archaeological contexts, including decorated caves, unusual artifact deposits, and structured features. The deep cave locations of some painted panels suggest that access was restricted, or that particular conditions influenced where art was placed. Deposits of artifacts in unusual locations such as crevices or remote cave chambers may represent ritual offerings, though alternative explanations including loss or discard cannot always be excluded. The terminal Paleolithic period, spanning approximately 15,000 to 11,700 years ago, witnessed significant changes in technology, subsistence, and settlement as populations adapted to warming climatic conditions and transforming landscapes. The Magdalenian tradition, which had dominated much of Western Europe during the late glacial period, showed regional fragmentation as groups developed localized responses to environmental changes. In southwestern France and northern Spain, late Magdalenian assemblages continued to feature elaborate bone and antler working, including decorated harpoons and spear throwers, while eastern regions developed different technological trajectories. The Azilian tradition emerged in Western Europe around 14,000 years ago as a successor to the Magdalenian. Azilian assemblages are characterized by smaller, less elaborate tools compared to preceding periods. Bone and antler working continued, but with reduced artistic elaboration. Painted pebbles bearing abstract red designs represent a distinctive Azilian artifact type, found at sites including Mas d'Azil in France. These pebbles show various geometric patterns including dots, lines, and cross-hatching, though their functions remain unknown. The reduction in artistic expression during the Azilian has led researchers to suggest changing social practices or symbolic systems. Contemporary with the Azilian in Western regions, the Federmesser and related industries developed in Northern Europe. These assemblages feature backed points and small scrapers suited to hunting in increasingly forested environments. The distribution of Federmesser sites extends across northern Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and southern Scandinavia, representing expansion of human populations into newly accessible northern territories as ice sheets retreated. Settlement patterns show use of both base camps and smaller specialized sites distributed across landscapes. In Mediterranean regions, terminal Paleolithic groups, including Romanellian populations in Italy, and Epipaleolithic groups in the Balkans, adapted to warming conditions and changing resource distributions. Coastal sites show evidence of intensified marine resource exploitation, including shellfish collection and fishing. The appearance of specialized fishing equipment, including bone hooks and net weights, indicates technological responses to increased importance of aquatic resources. Inland sites continued to focus on terrestrial game, particularly red deer, which expanded into newly forested regions. Microliths, small geometric stone tools including triangles, crescents, and trapezes, became increasingly common during the terminal Paleolithic. These implements were hafted in series to create composite tools, including arrows, harpoons, and knives. The production of microliths required systematic bladelet manufacture and specialized retouch techniques to create desired geometric forms. The efficiency of microlith technology in terms of raw material use and functional versatility contributed to its widespread adoption across diverse environmental settings. Bow and arrow technology, inferred from microlith forms and rare preservation of wooden components, became increasingly important during this period. Arrows armed with microlith points provided effective hunting weapons in forested environments, where stalking individual animals replaced the open country pursuit of herds. The penetrating power and accuracy of arrows allowed hunters to take prey at greater distances compared to thrusting spears. Evidence for arrow use includes impact fractures on microliths, consistent with high-velocity impacts, and occasional finds of arrows preserved in waterlogged contexts. Fishing technologies expanded during the terminal Paleolithic. Bone and antler harpoons with multiple barbs appear in assemblages from sites near rivers, lakes, and coasts. These implements were designed to penetrate fish and maintain attachment through barbed projections. Fixed fishing installations, including weirs and traps, may have been constructed, though direct evidence is limited due to poor preservation of wooden structures. The accumulation of fish bones at some sites indicates that fishing contributed substantially to subsistence. Plant food exploitation intensified, as evidenced by increased frequencies of grinding stones and accumulations of charred plant remains. Hazelnuts appear in large quantities at terminal Paleolithic and early Mesolithic sites, representing an important storable resource. Seeds of various plant species, including water lily, acorns, and wild grasses, show evidence of processing and consumption. The labor investment in plant collection and processing suggests these resources provided significant dietary contributions, particularly during seasons when hunting success was limited. Settlement patterns shifted toward reduced mobility and increased use of particular locations. Sites showing evidence of substantial structures, deep midden deposits, and diverse activity areas indicate longer occupation durations compared to earlier Paleolithic patterns. The establishment of base camps occupied for months or entire seasons allowed exploitation of locally available resources without constant relocation. Smaller satellite camps continued to be used for specialized hunting, fishing, or raw material procurement activities. Cemeteries containing multiple burials appear more frequently during the terminal Paleolithic. Sites such as Tevioc and Hoedic in Brittany contain burials of multiple individuals, accompanied by shell ornaments and other grave goods. The establishment of formal burial grounds suggests stronger territorial attachments and possibly population growth requiring more structured disposal of the dead. The reuse of burial locations over generations indicates continuity of occupation and memory of place. Population densities likely increased during the terminal Paleolithic as environmental productivity rose with warming climate. The expansion of forests supported larger animal biomass, while rivers and wetlands provided concentrated aquatic resources. Higher population densities created opportunities for more frequent social interactions and potentially greater social complexity. Regional population growth may have contributed to development of more defined territories and increased competition for prime resource locations. Exchange networks continued to operate. Though the materials and scales of exchange may have shifted, marine shells still moved inland from coasts, but the distances traveled and quantities involved remain difficult to assess from available evidence. High-quality lithic raw materials continued to be transported, though the emergence of regional microlith styles suggests increasing localization of technological traditions. The balance between long-distance exchange and local production may have shifted toward greater regional self-sufficiency. Artistic production during the terminal Paleolithic appears reduced compared to earlier Upper Paleolithic periods. Decorated caves continued to be visited and possibly marked with new images, though the chronology of cave art makes it difficult to determine when specific images were created. Portable art, including engraved and carved objects, continues, but with different stylistic characteristics compared to earlier periods. Whether these changes reflect actual reductions in artistic activity or shifts in the types of artistic expression remains debated. The Younger Dryas cold reversal from 12,900 to 11,700 years ago created challenges for terminal Paleolithic populations. The return to near-glacial conditions forced adaptations including possible population movements, shifts in resource use, and technological adjustments. Some regions show evidence of site abandonment during the Younger Dryas, while others contain continuous occupation sequences. The archaeological record during this cold phase shows development of new tool types and subsistence strategies that would characterize early Mesolithic societies. The final termination of the Younger Dryas at 11,700 years ago marked the beginning of the Holocene and the end of the Paleolithic. The rapid warming and environmental transformations that followed represented the most dramatic climatic shift that human populations had experienced in recent millennia. The expansion of dense temperate forests across formerly open landscapes fundamentally altered resource distributions and required new adaptive strategies. The transition from Paleolithic to Mesolithic represents both continuity in populations and substantial changes in lifeways. Early Mesolithic societies emerging after 11,700 years ago showed technological and economic patterns that developed from terminal Paleolithic foundations. Microliths continued to dominate stone tool assemblages, with regional variations in geometric forms. Settlement patterns showed further trends toward reduced mobility and increased use of logistically organized subsistence strategies. The exploitation of forest resources, aquatic habitats, and diverse plant foods intensified as populations adapted to post-glacial environments. The colonization of previously glaciated regions accelerated during the early Holocene. Northern Germany, southern Scandinavia, and Britain saw establishment of Mesolithic populations exploiting newly available territories. These pioneering groups brought technologies and knowledge adapted to temperate forest environments. The rapid spread of human populations into northern regions demonstrates the flexibility and adaptability of Mesolithic societies to diverse environmental conditions. Regional differentiation increased during the Mesolithic as populations adapted to specific local environments and developed distinctive cultural traditions. Coastal groups in different regions evolved specialized maritime adaptations, while inland populations focused on riverine and terrestrial resources. The archaeological record shows greater diversity in artifact styles, settlement types, and subsistence strategies compared to earlier periods when environmental conditions and human adaptations showed more uniformity across Europe. The Paleolithic-Mesolithic transition represents a gradual process rather than an abrupt break. Changes in technology, subsistence, and settlement accumulated over several millennia as populations responded to environmental transformations. The fundamental patterns of hunting, gathering, and fishing that characterized Paleolithic societies persisted into the Mesolithic and beyond. The distinction between Paleolithic and Mesolithic primarily reflects environmental context and adaptive strategies rather than fundamental changes in human capabilities or social organization. The Holocene interglacial provided environmental conditions that allowed human populations to expand, diversify, and eventually develop new economic systems that would transform human societies in subsequent millennia.